thank the
1 second, Sidra. Let's just let the live stream start, and that way everyone who's watching later will get the fullness of your remarks and not get you starting mid word.
Okay.
Right, I think we're good to go.
Okay. So I want to thank the intrepid Sherry for organizing this and for organizing the entire series. I'm sure we're all very grateful. Those of you with sharp eyes will learn the one word change in the title of my talk, From Citizens to Inhabitants, how 2,000 years of Hebrew poetry can save the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the perils of proximity. Unfortunately, not all the inhabitants of Jerusalem are citizens, as you all know. A few preliminary remarks. First of all, about worship and study, my second or third home. Once again, I feel Ben Sion's spirit hovering over this community, which has managed to survive despite many challenges: the proliferation of religious options in the Harvard community, the loss of so many precious members, including the first captain of our ship. And lahavdil, may we all wish Millie Guberman Kravitz, our centenarian, a very happy birthday. I know she's not here, but I know that our wishes go to her and her family. And something harder to measure, the diminishment of a certain form of Jewish consciousness and ethic that Bernie and I and many of you present today marinated in as young adults, and that Ben Sion embodied. It's almost exactly a year since I last appeared here to talk about my Hebrew book on Shlosha Paitanim, the poets of the sacred quotidian, that had recently been published. It was Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2021 to be exact. We thought things were bad enough then, what with the plague entering its second year and having narrowly escaped a second Trump term. But of course, we had no idea what was coming: Ukraine. Recall what W.H. Auden wrote on September 1st, 1939, as the war was beginning that would encompass the world. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. And it was the same poet who wrote, after the death of William Butler Yeats, that poetry makes nothing happen. Why then do we turn to poetry and to love in such dark times, when, like in 1939, one mad dictator has already wrought so much death, suffering, and destruction, and we have no idea what is coming? Because those are our consolations, love and poetry, even as they are so fragile and dependent on basic material comforts to survive. In a way, that is the main argument of my book, that although poetry makes nothing happen, it can actually save us from our basest instincts. In this case, the basest instincts belong to those cynics for whom naked power is the only touchstone of human life, and whose view of the world is shaped by some tragic theodicy, such as the Akedah in our tradition. It took a comic who fantasized himself into the role of Prime Minister of Ukraine to remind us of the power of the word against the sword and of the hope that is the secret of the comic impulse. My own focus is on Jerusalem and recovering the same muscle, the poetic muscle, and yes, the comic impulse and compassion that is its other side, is what I think can save the children of Abraham from annihilating each other. I'm claiming that our poetry can save us from our own form of political and religious insanity. So for the next few minutes, I wish to share with you my way of figuring Jerusalem in light of today's politics and poetics. A few of you were present on January 20th for my book launch at Berkeley. I'll try not to repeat too much for your sake, although the main thread of my argument has, of course, not changed. Let's start with the Parashat Shavua for the week after next. 2 weeks from yesterday, we will be reading Shmini from the book of Leviticus, the section that I have always regarded as the most horrific in the Torah, even taking into account the fratricide of the sons of Adam, the slaughter of Amalek, the plagues, and the death of the firstborn Egyptians, succeeded by their soldiers drowning in the Red Sea. I'm referring, of course, to the precipitous death of the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu. This is particularly on my mind because that parasha and those very verses from Leviticus 10 are the ones assigned to my granddaughter Lena when she becomes a bat mitzvah, God willing, the Shabbat after next. How can we connect that to the title of this talk? How 2,000 years of Hebrew poetry can save the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the perils of proximity. First of all, let's recall the circumstances under which Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, were struck down. It starts innocently enough. The priests, with Aaron at their head, are learning their craft in the desert, preparing the sacrifices at the tent of meeting, the Ohel Moed, as prescribed by God. Moses and Aaron enter the tent of meeting and successfully bring the sacrifice, and trailing clouds of glory, as it were, they exit, coming out to the adoring crowd. Can you see it? Because in my screen, I see all the little boxes, and I don't know whether you can actually see the text. Can you see it?
Yeah, we see it.
Okay. And Moses and Aaron with him came into the tent of meeting, and they came out and blessed the people. And the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. And a fire came out from before the Lord and consumed on the altar the burnt offering and the fat. And all the people saw and shouted with joy and fell on their faces. Moshe ve'Aaron, I can't see it, so I'm going to move this. Ve'avo Moshe ve'Aaron el Ohel Moed, ויצאו ויברכו את העם, ויראה כבוד אדוני אל כל העם. ותצא אש מלפני אדוני, ותאכל על המזבח את העולה ואת החלבים, וירא כל העם וירונו, ויפלו על פניהם. Then, seemingly imitating Aaron's actions, his sons, Nadav and Abihu, prepare their own sacrifice. You remember what happens next. ויקחו בניו של אהרון, נדב ואביהו, אש מתכתו, ויתנו בהם אש, וישימו עליה קטורת, ויקריבו לפני אדוני אש זרה, אשר לא ציווה אותם. ותצא אש מלפני אדוני, ותאכל אותם, וימותו לפני אדוני. And the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, took each of them his fire pan, and put fire in it, and placed incense upon it, and brought forward alien fire before the Lord, which he had not charged them. And fire came out before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. 6 chapters later, in the reading adopted for Yom Kippur, this event is succinctly recalled as the sin of and punishment for drawing too close to the presence of the Lord. Bekorvatam lifnei Adonai ve'yamutu. That's Leviticus 16:1. Although this incident becomes ingrained in the mind of every observant Jew, is recalled not only in the lectionary cycle, but also on the holiest day of the year, there are additional examples in the Hebrew Bible of instant punishment meted out to those who, unscripted, come too close to the source of holiness. Think of poor Uzzah. King David and his entourage were triumphantly accompanying the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem on an ox-driven cart. When the cart stumbled, Uzzah put up his hand to steady the ark and was instantly struck down. That's in Samuel 2:6-5-15. That was enough to terrify the king into sequestering the ark for 3 months before he finally found the courage to bring it to the city of David. This did not escape the attention of the rabbis, who decreed that this passage on David and Uzzah be read as the maftir for Shmini, thus connecting the two stories of the lethal consequences of proximity to the sacred. Why such horrific and ostensibly unprovoked punishment for such innocent acts? It's pretty clear from the pshat, the unadorned text, that Nadav and Avihu did not purposely bring strange fire. And certainly Uzzah was acting spontaneously in trying to keep the Aron HaKodesh from toppling. This is the way Robert Alter, that's Alter with an E, explains the impossible passage about Nadav and Avihu. Quote, God's holiness implies an ontological division or chasm between the creator and the created world, a concept that sets off biblical monotheism from the worldview of antecedent polytheisms, where at least the king could serve as mediator between the human and the divine. Dividing, setting apart, the erection of barriers to access are notions that suffuse all the regulations here about the tabernacle, Mishkan, more literally God's terrestrial dwelling place. Again and again, we are reminded that ordinary Israelites are to keep their distance from the sacred space of the sanctuary, that no unauthorized person may come forward. The Hebrew karav, which in these texts has much the sense of encroach, end of quote. This is in a way the entire argument of my book, that the danger of kirva el HaKodesh, of proximity to the sacred, is as great now as it was in the days of poor Nadav and Avihu, or poor Uzzah, drawing too close to the presence of the Lord. Vekorvatam lifnei Adonai vayamutu. I wish to disagree with my mentor, Robert Uri Alter, in one thing, that the tabernacle, or later the temple, is God's terrestrial dwelling place. One of the central arguments in my book is that there is an internal debate within the Hebrew Bible itself about the location of God's presence. Does God dwell in the Mishkan, or in a house such as the one Solomon built for him? Rather, listen to the words of God to King David. Only you will not build the house, but your son, who issues from your loins, he will build the house for my name. That's from 1 Kings 8:19. Rather than God's dwelling place, then, it is the place from which the human can name the divine, can petition and call to the divine, a house for my name. And he's actually correcting Shlomo here, who says, I have a beautiful house and I want to build a house for you. And God is kind of chastising him and saying, thank you, but build a house for my name. Clearly, there's enough sanctity attached to the Ohel Moed and then to the temple, and since the destruction, to the ruins of the temple or the site itself, so that for 3,000 years, the Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians have been fighting for hegemony over the site. If rather than living in a house or even in a lavish temple, God's glory fills the universe, milo kol haaretz kevodo, then what are we fighting about? Indeed, the city and the sacred center is proving just as toxic and intoxicating now as it was 3,000 years ago. Its toxicity spreads throughout the body politic, infecting every attempt at civic resolution that is not based on exclusive, inscrutable, and peremptory divine promise. If, as I am arguing, the antidote to the lure and the danger of proximity to the sacred can come from the accumulated wisdom of 2,000 years of negotiating distance through compensatory practices and ersatz spaces, we must nevertheless note, even before we enter the city, that in both instances just cited, there's an assumption that holiness resides in or hovers over a place or object. What can save us from the temptation of proximity to the sacred? Two practices, I think, can re-educate us vis-a-vis the sacred center, and they are embedded in our own traditions and texts. First of all, I'm suggesting a literary reading of the most constitutive texts in the Bible, and certainly as regards Jerusalem, the Akedah and Song of Songs. That is, I suggest we return to a kind of fundamentalist reading of these texts. First, the Akedah as comedy, read straight without the layers of appropriation and commentary. And I'm happy to expand on that because for most people, when I say the Akedah is really a comedy, they look at me as if I really lost my marbles. But I will try to substantiate that in the questions if you wish. The second reading is the Song of Songs read as pshat, without importing into the text what is not there, namely the temple in Jerusalem and the divine presence. Again, the rabbis and the church fathers worked overtime in their commentaries on the Song of Songs to introduce the divine presence exactly in the places where it wasn't in the text. And again, we can talk more about that in the questions or comments. The second major practice is what I call the wisdom learned in diaspora, the wisdom of the erzatz spaces, the bimkom. First and foremost, the synagogue as substitute for the temple, mikdash me'at. Reading as substitute for sacrificing. The entire diasporic culture as substitute, as providing ways of worshiping God without sacrifice, the sacrifice of Isaac or of Ishmael. The distance from the sacred that should be imported into the sacred center after 2,000 years of navigating distance. I will end with two examples from my book which deal with the Akedah. Isaac Kumer in Kodesh HaKodashim. It's hard to summarize the story of Yitzchak Kumer from Tmol Shalshom. I'm hoping that at least some of you have read it either in Hebrew or in English. But Yitzchak Kumer is a very simple man who lives in Galicia and works in his father's store. He's useless in his father's store because all he can do is dream of going to Eretz Yisrael and becoming a chalutz. He goes to Eretz Yisrael. He tries to become a chalutz. He's a complete failure at that. He tries to live in Tel Aviv and to go to all the cafes where they're discussing politics and all the politicians and literati are assembled. And he falls in love with Sonia. He fails at love in Sonia. He basically fails in Tel Aviv. And he goes to Jerusalem and he ends up in Mea Sharim. And he falls in love with Shifra and actually manages to marry Shifra. In the meantime, rather than becoming a chalutz, he's become a painter. He's a house painter and a sign painter. There's much more to the story, and I'm not going to say much more about it because some of you know it, and those who don't, I don't want to spoil it for you. But it's as a house and a sign painter that Kumer gains a certain reputation. Now, the passage that I'm going to show you next is a passage which is hidden in between several noisy pages in the book and is for the most part overlooked by most of the critics that I read. But it's really an interesting section. As a house and sign painter, Kumer gains a certain reputation, and he's commissioned by the Turkish Pasha to repair their house of worship on our Temple Mount. כשהוצרכו לתקן את מקדשם שבהר הבית, וביקשו להביא צבעים ממצרים, אמר הפחה, הריני שולח לכם בחור יהודי, שכל אומני מצרים כנגדו כי יתוש בפני גמל, ושלח להם את חברנו, את יצחק. ואפשר שיצחק יחיד היה בדבר זה, שנכנס לפני ולפנים, ועשה מלאכה במקום מקדשנו, ששאר בעלי אומנויות שבירושלים חוששים להיכנס לשם, מפני שאנו טמאי מתים, ואין לנו אפר פרה. חבל שיצחק חברנו אינו בעל סיפורים, ואינו יודע לספר מה שראו עיניו שם. And when they needed to repair their temple on the Temple Mount and wanted to bring painters from Egypt, the Pasha said, here, I'll send you a Jewish fellow. Next to him, all the Egyptian craftsmen are like a mosquito in front of a camel. And he sent them our comrade Isaac. And Isaac may have been the only one to enter the Holy of Holies and to practice his craft in the place of our temple, which all the other craftsmen of Jerusalem are afraid to enter, for we are defiled by corpses and do not have the ashes of the heifer. Too bad our comrade Isaac isn't much of a storyteller and can't tell what his eyes saw there. Again, one could go on endlessly about this little passage. I just want to mention, of course, many of you heard in the Hebrew, even in the English, the echoes of the Akedah, Yachid Haya, even his name Yitzchak. The fact that he goes into the Kodesh HaKodashim, into the place that one is not supposed to enter, but he can do it because of his craft. He's a painter, and in a way, painting the walls of the Mizgad, presumably, provides him with a kind of distance from the sacred. It's the very distance that I'm arguing on behalf of. The rest of us are too defiled, and we don't have the ashes of the heifer, as what many of you know. There are some young people who are now trying to raise the red heifer so that they can create the ashes, so that when the third temple is built, God forbid, they can reinstate these sacrifices. Too bad our comrade isn't much of a Isaac isn't much of a storyteller and can't tell what his eyes saw there, and the narrator doesn't try to tell us what he saw there. But I find this to be, in a way, one of the most revealing passages in the entire book, which is something like 600 pages. And one more Akedah comment. And again, I'm really happy to talk more about the Akedah as I see it. The Akedah is comedy. But I want to finish by reading, or almost finish by reading Yudah Amichai's poems, Three Sons Had Abraham, in which I think he introduces, if not the comic, then the compassionate son, who is, if you will, the brother or the twin of the comic son. Three sons had Abraham, not just two. Three sons had Abraham, Ishmael, Yitzchak, and Yivke. First came Ishmael, God will hear. Next came Yitzchak, he will laugh. The last was Yivke, he will cry. No one has ever heard of Yivke, for he was the youngest, the son that father loved best, the son who was offered up on Mount Moriah. Ishmael was saved by his mother Hagar. Yitzchak was saved by the angel. But Yivke, no one saved. When he was just a little boy, his father would call him tenderly, Yivke, Yivkele, my sweet little Yivki. But he sacrificed him all the same. The Torah says the ram, but it was Yivke. Ishmael never heard from God again. Yitzchak never laughed again. Sarah laughed only once, then laughed no more. Three sons had Abraham. Ishma will hear, Yitzchak will laugh, Yivke will cry. Ishmael, Yitzchak-el, Yivke-el. God will hear, God will laugh, God will cry. I'm going to try to end on a more hopeful note. So I'll explain why I chose the cover of Figuring Jerusalem that you saw in the beginning. Wait a second. Sorry, let me just read this in Hebrew. שלושה בנים היו לאברהם ולא רק שניים, שלושה בנים היו לאברהם, ישמעאל ויצחק ויבכה. אף אחד לא שמע על יבכה, כי הוא היה קטן והאהוב שהוא עלה לעולה בהר המוריה. את ישמעאל הצילה אמו הגר, את יצחק הציל המלאך, ואת יבכה לא הציל אף אחד. כשהיה קטן קרא לו אביו באהבה, יבכה, יבכה קטן. והחמוד שלי, אבל הוא הקריב אותו בעקדה. ובתורה כתוב העיל, אבל זה היה יבכה. ישמעאל לא שמע שוב על אל בכל ימיו. יצחק שוב לא צחק בכל ימיו, ושרה צחקה רק פעם אחת ולא הוסיפה. 3 בנים היו לאברהם, ישמע, יצחק, יבכה, ישמעאל, יצחקאל, יבכאל. And now for the cover. And what the text that you see appears in the prologue to my book, and you can see the cover itself. So before reading the text, I want to say that it was because I think that Menashe Kadishman's rendering of the Wailing Wall, which is what the picture is here, with its splashes of color, is the best graphic representation of my argument. If we learn to import the wisdom of 2,000 years of living at a distance from the sacred, wisdom that is actually encapsulated in our most sacred texts and our poetry and philosophy, if read with a fresh eye, if in addition to our tears, we cover the wall with the colors of our hope and our respect for the sanctity of all God's creatures, if we manage to distance ourselves from the sacred with poetry, with paint or music, and resist the centripetal pull of the sacred sacrificial center, well, then maybe we have a chance. And now for the text in the last slide. I wrote the last draft of this book during the coronavirus lockdown of the spring of 2020, when the plaza in front of the Wailing Wall was devoid of its usual crowds. Yet the empty space revealed a profound truth. As with all religious shrines, what has made this site holy is the procession of worshipers over the centuries who have desperately poured out their hearts and their prayers. It became sacred not because of the presence of divine grandeur, but by the accumulation of human pathos. No one put it better than Mark Twain in his irreverent version of One Pilgrim's Progress. Towards the end of Innocents Abroad, after visiting the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, he allowed his Protestant American skepticism to fall away briefly in the face of the generations that have sanctified the place. Quote, "For 1,500 years its shrines have been wet with the tears of pilgrims from the earth's remotest confines." So I would just conclude by saying, may we see many more pilgrims coming to wet the wall with their tears and also with their laughter. So I'm going to stop here. Great. And you can unmute yourselves and make comments, ask questions.
Thank you so much, Sidra. This is very enlightening and a lot of food for thought. And I'm ready to go out and get the book, especially with a 20% discount.
Yeah, I think you all saw that there's in your invitation to today's talk, there's also a flyer with the option of buying the book with a 20% discount. Yeah. And hopefully hard covers will be available. That is, the hard copies will be available. I think that's almost the case. Yeah, go ahead, Sherry.
I'm sorry. I'm wondering if you would just talk a little more about the comic aspects of the Akedah.
Yeah.
Maybe you said it, but I didn't get it, or
okay.
You can elaborate a little.
Well, I know. I mean, the first, as I say, the first response of anybody who hears me say that is they either think I'm crazy or I'm reading some other text or something. But other people have pointed this out. I'm not the only one, but I think that my reading is maybe the most expansive. Uri Alter in his translation and commentary to the Bible points out, and this is something which is easily verifiable, the 5 chapters that surround chapter 21 in Genesis, which is the 22 in Genesis, which is the Akedah chapter, the 5 chapters have some version of the word tzahak, laughter, 20 times. Now, as we say in Hebrew, Zomer Dalsheni. And again, Robert Alter was the one who taught us to look for patterns, for both narrative patterns, but also for repetition, word repetitions. And of course, the word tzachok appears in Yitzchak's name. His name literally means he will laugh, although the future tense is not quite the way it would have been in biblical Hebrew. But in any event, it has the word tzachok in it. Any of us can point out that Isaac's experience on the altar was not one that would tickle the comic muscle. And in fact, right after that experience, he basically loses. The only time that the word tzachok is associated with his name is at some point when he's fondling his wife. But it's much more like sexual dalliance. But there is, and again, if we had more time, I could go into it, but it's in the book. There is not only the word Yitzchak in all of its different permutations, but both Abraham and Sarah laugh. And Sarah is just about doubled up with laughter. Abraham laughs and God reprimands her and says, "Why are you laughing?" And she says, No, I didn't laugh. And he says, "Well, you did laugh. I mean, after all, he can read people's thoughts." I think it can almost be acted as shtick. And there are a few people, including, Woody Allen and a few others who have picked this up, but very few. And what happened very quickly, as you all know, is that the Akedat Yitzchak became our crucifixion. It morphed into in the New Testament into the actual crucifixion, but it also became our symbol of martyrdom very early on. And it's very hard to dislodge that understanding of the Akedah, which continues into modern Hebrew poetry. And I spent a lot of time on that in the book. But again, the other piece of this that's important is not just the word repetition, but the structure. One of the things that we learn in our early classes in literature is that the comic, and this is true from classical days till the present, the comic is tragedy with a happy ending, tragedy with Deus ex machina. And you don't have Deus ex machina more powerful than the angel coming down and, saying to Abraham, and of course he has to repeat his name because Abraham is too intent on doing the deed, but he stops him from doing it, right? We just forget that. And the Akedah becomes the topos of the Jewish tragedy. So I'm reading it as it were literally. I'm reading it as it were naively, without commentary. The same thing is true of Song of Songs. I read the Song of Songs as a naked love song in Jerusalem, without all the commentary, as I indicated, that the rabbis and the church fathers replace all the missing pieces, like the temple that is missing in the text. So, yeah, that's a long response to a short question.
No, now I get it more, and the happy ending, so to speak, completes the
Irv,
picture.
your hand is up, Irv.
Yes, Sidra, thank you so much, not only for the talk, but for your books. You referred to the challenges facing the Abrahamic religions over the years and their conflict over space and so forth. I'm reminded with your comments about the Akedah that Islam has a whole holiday that remembers the sacrifice of Ishmael.
Exactly. Yes.
And they sacrifice animals and so on and so forth. I suspect that I wonder if there are Islamic scholars that, and of course they believe that that Ishmael was the only son, the first son, and therefore that's what the Bible describes. But I wonder how their scholars have responded to your
Reading.
interpretation of this story as allegory or commentary.
Well,
Or,
it's an interesting question, Irv. I think the truth is, I mean, the truth. I am in conversation with one one Arabic scholar at Duke University, and we haven't actually quite discussed this, but I have read some of the sources. Of course, we have to remember that the Islamic tradition not only succeeded the Jewish and the Christian, but also they were they themselves, those who composed the Quran and also who commented were conversant not only with the Hebrew Bible, but also with some of the early Midrashim and so on. So there's an ongoing dialogue there, which is just fascinating. I'm not qualified to say much more about that, but I appreciate you're mentioning that, surely. But once again, that's the whole idea that somehow we have to be sacrificed in that very spot, for both traditions. And then of course the Christian traditions, which, place the crucifixion not far from the Dome of the Rock. So there you are. They're all three there together and, with their swords out or.
Can I just add a word? Because I think what you said, sacrifice for that spot also. And I think part of the reason why you raise the question of comedy is that you want to, in some sense, diffuse the so-called holiness of the spot being sacralized by the pathos of the original sacrifice there, or the presumed sacrifice there. And I think that's the real weight, the gravity of your insight about this. I mean, we've talked about this 1,000 times in bed and elsewhere, but I mean, I just feel like we ought not to kind of lose the thread here, that a part of the reason why people regard the Temple Mount as having this sort of holy quality is because of the pathos of the original sacrifice there, which I think you so, creatively diffuse by simply describing the original text as a comedy, which it is.
Well, I have to say, first of all, that my husband burst in, even though Peter had raised his hand very politely.
I'm actually going to.
But he has certain prerogatives, and he knows the book very well. Peter, please ask your question. Unmute yourself.
Thanks. Hi, a couple of comments. I really appreciate every time I can see you, even if it's at a distance. So this is terrific, and thank you so much. Couple of thoughts. One, which is the echo of the notion of staying away from the holy, or staying away from the sacred, which occurs historically in the Bible, in the mountain scene where God tells Moses to tell the people, or Aaron to tell the people, to stay away from the mountain. And I'm not sure if there is a fence that supposedly is put around the mountain, and this is a way in which, because he says if people come close to the mountain or come too close, they'll die. Mm-hmm. So in other words, this space that you're talking about as I'm not saying it's metaphorical, but a sacred space is actually is a physical mountain, and this mountain was at least represents where the God did dwell, And he did come down. So there is a sort of a propinquity there. And I guess the second,
Wait, Peter, can I interrupt you? Because I want to stop there and make, and
Sure.
clarify something. What you're talking about, I believe, is Mount Sinai.
yes.
That's the place where the people, and of course, that's not the Temple Mount. I mean, it's a very
no.
interesting
Right.
point that we have more than one sacred place.
Oh, that's
Only
right.
sacred, it's only sacred when Moses is meeting God, right? Like the
Yeah.
Ohel Moed is sacred as they're moving through the desert. So, and then of course the temple. So I just wanted to stop you there too. But
Sure.
there's also the burning bush, right? There's Nikrat Hatzur where God reveals his backside, but he has to hide Moses and Moses is the only one who faces God and does not die. He's the only one. And that's really important. Yeah, go ahead. You had another point.
Well, and doesn't die. In other words, he somehow has this, whatever you want to call it, this wonderful character. I don't want to, I could talk about it offline in terms of the comic aspects of it. But the other thing, which is maybe more radical, maybe going a step too far, is what would be the results of taking the sacred out of the equation? If we have on one side, we have the people, and we have an attempt to conceive of some way of thinking about a power or force or a spirit that is a way of which religion has at its center. How does it square if you want to resolve the issue by saying, this whole notion of the sacred is bogus. It's something that we have just invented, we've created. It creates, all that it does is create death and destruction between people. We find it's very, very easy when you bring people together in all kinds of settings in Israel or outside of Israel, Muslims and Jews, they seem to get along. They don't need this barrier of the sacred in order to relate, in order to do good works. So, the sacred doesn't really matter for those encounters. And I'm just wondering what your reaction would be.
Well, that's really interesting. It's very radical. I don't quite go that far. My hero is Yuda Amichai, who, as many of you know, he lived his last years with his wife Hannah lived in Mishkenot Sha'ananim, and the vadi between Mishkenot Sha'ananim and the Temple Mount, the whole holy base, the whole holy site, is the place that's where he talks about he loses his son and the Arab loses his goat, and each of them is looking for their in that space. It's the spaces between humans particularly is, I think, where he would locate the sacred. And he talks about it as living on the makaf, living on the hyphen. For him, it's living on the hyphen between birth and death, but it's also the hyphen between human beings. It's like, that's where the holy resides. It doesn't take the holy out of the equation. Certainly God is a character in Amichai's poetry. And when he says, when I bend down to pick up something that I dropped, I bow to God. That is my religion. That is my God. That is my religion. Or he talks about, many of you are familiar with these poems about his mother's, he envisions God like his mother who has her hand in the chicken, preparing the chicken for Friday night. God is like a garajnik underneath the world, So it's not, God doesn't get taken out of the encounter, but you don't kill and be killed for God, right? So I don't think it's necessary to go quite as far as you've gone. What would we do without God? God, as my beloved Grace Paley said, God is good for conversation. And God is good for poetry. And we need God for, as an address for our prayers. So I wouldn't take that out, but I would take out this idea of the locus of the sacred. God lives in a building. God lives on a rock. God lives even in a bush, right? No. The entire universe is filled with God's glory. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. Anybody else? Jim.
You talked about how the way of relating to the sacred that the distance from the sacred that developed during the years of living in diaspora can be valuable today. And I was wondering if that also could be found anywhere in the poetry that came from the diaspora, whether it was more recently or in older times, because you haven't offered any example of that today.
Just only because there was not enough time, but thank you. Yes, of course. I mean, we could go to the Psalms, and most of the Psalms were meant to be spoken on the steps of the temple, but when we recite them, we also recite them in all kinds of surrogate spaces. But think of the poetry of Yehuda Levi, as an example. I mean, the poetic voice itself, the voice of the paitan, of the sacred poet, is exactly that. And as you know, the synagogue was referred to as Mikdash Me'at, as a miniature temple. The Talmud itself was meant to be a place, where one would read instead of bringing sacrifices. I mean, I think, and also my argument is that it wasn't just when we were living in diaspora, but that diasporic wisdom was imported into Israel in its first 20 years before 1967. I mean, the first half century of Israel's existence before it was a state and after was living at a distance from the sacred. The one writer that I haven't mentioned, because I did mention Agnon, but Agnon, particularly in his great novel Tmos Shishon, but also even in his person, I think was very, very conflicted about the idea of the distance from or the proximity to the sacred. And from 1967 till he died in 1970, the report is that he never actually approached the Wailing Wall. This is the report that his biographer brings us. He was very skeptical about it. So anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but yes, of course, there are many, many examples. I think most of the beautiful prayers that we appreciate on the high holidays, those that have been left in our prayer books, are the piyutim, and many of them are poems of longing for Jerusalem, but also the poems themselves are substitutes for all the things that we did in the temple, right? Any other questions or comments?
It was a wonderful talk, Sidra. So profound and moving and so much to think about. You're so eloquent and so learned and carry it with such grace. Thank you so much.
Well, coming from someone who is so learned and eloquent and has so much grace herself, I take that as the highest compliment, Judith. It's really wonderful to be in conversation with you. I mean, we're not a huge group, but these are very precious interlocutors for me, and being able to do this given the distance, given all the challenges that we're all facing and the horrors in the world around us, it's just, I mean, it really is a moment of grace for me to be with all of you. I want to thank you for taking the time out and for your comments and your presence.
Chaya, did you have your hand up? Or you have to unmute.
Sorry, I forgot about the mute.
Yeah.
It was very, very interesting and very thought-provoking. Thank you, Sidra. I'm still preoccupied with the concept of comedic elements in the Akedah. I just can't help but resist it.
Okay,
So
so
if you have
so go
another
back.
moment, beside
okay.
the happy ending, what else tickles the bone?
You have to, honestly, you have to go back and read it. You have to read those 17 chapters, 5 chapters from Genesis 17 through 22 and count the times that laughter appears. But the most, I mean, it's really slapstick. I don't have it in front of me to read to you, but the moment when Sarah is listening at the tent flap as, you know, the annunciation is coming that she's going to have a child, and she says, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, right? What? I'm like 90 years, my husband is 99 and I'm 90 and I'm going to have pleasure. And she uses the word that reflects sexual pleasure, vatitzchak, and she laughed. And then God,
but this is about infertility clinic humor. But I'm talking about a father and son and a mother that is excluded from the most horrific experience that could be described, or one of the most. And the struggle that Abraham must have gone through of making a choice, and the feeling of the child walking, carrying, being bound, not a word uttered. I can't find a comic element in it.
no, I agree. There are elements, I believe, in the Annunciation scenes, both with Sarah and with Abraham, that are really worth rereading, because she's tickled. She can't believe it. She says, I'm going to have sexual pleasure and I'm an old lady. And he also laughs. The laughter disappears. Not only does Abraham not share, and of course, Kierkegaard talks about this. There are so many different commentaries of all kinds about this. And I'm certainly not the first to comment on this story, but the fact that Abraham clearly doesn't tell Sarah what he's about to do. And then the fact that in the next parasha, she dies. And of course, we know it, all the Midrashim are telling us that Satan came to her and said, your son has just been sacrificed, and doesn't get to say, but it didn't happen, and she, etc. We know that. The fact that afterwards, I mean, Isaac is clearly suffering afterwards from PTSD. I don't think there's any question about it. The same way, if I may say so, that Aaron is suffering when his sons have just been struck down, and Moses turns to him and it says, Vayidom Aharon. He's in shock. I mean, these things are not spared us in the biblical. That's what makes the Hebrew Bible so rich. I'm not talking about comedy in the slapstick sense, slipping on banana peels, clearly. I'm talking about it both structurally and rhetorically. And that's why I would love for you to read my chapter.
I will.
But the other piece of it that I argue, and this is something, is again, I did not find in any of the scholars of Agnon, and there are many wonderful scholars that have written about it, is that the story of Yitzhak Kumer is first of all a comedy. It's only at the end that the Akedah sort of comes and overwhelms it with his death, with his hideous death by rabies. But up until the time that the dog bites him, he is enacting the comedy of Yitzhak. So the tragedy comes to overwhelm the story, and so we don't even remember the comic elements. But thank you. I appreciate
Thanks.
it to spend a little time going into it, and I really hope that we have a chance to talk more about this
I
particular
do
chapter.
too, and I will read it.
Thank you, Chaya. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Well, thank you, Sidra. We're so appreciative. You're coming all these miles and cheering up our day and giving us something to laugh about and think about.
Well,
I
thank
hope
you.
we hear you again.
And yes, and we will. We will hear from you again. I know it.
I think you guys are stuck with us. I think Bernie's going to do at some point too. And thank you all for joining. Stay safe, stay well, and let's pray to whatever God we pray to, that somehow this horrible war in Ukraine will be brought to an end.
And I hear you're going to have snow in Jerusalem on Purim.
That's what they say. I don't always count on these promises, though. Okay, happy
Send
Purim,
along,
everybody.
Happy
Sherry,
Purim.
yeah,
Thank you.
Sherry, send
Thank
along
you.
the link to the book again, could you, with the poster? That'd
Yeah,
be great.
sure, sure.
Didn't come out the way it should. So
Oh.
I want everyone to get it.
Okay, will do. And don't forget, tell your friends that this has been recorded so they can watch it if they missed it.
Yeah,
Yes.
I will, you know what I'll do is let me right now put the,
Put it in chat.
I'll put the, all right, I'm putting the link to, first of all, I put a link to Ilya Kaminsky's article in the Times this morning, which is very much on the same theme. Why in the midst of war are all of his friends saying send poetry, as opposed to, you know, send guns.
Well,
And,
you did both.
and then also here is the, here also in the chat is the YouTube link for this session. So you copy it before we ring off, you can feel free to distribute it and people will be able to watch it at their leisure.
And also where you can buy the book, that we put that in the announcement, where you could get the book with a discount.
Yeah, I don't have that right at my fingertips, but if someone wants to put it in the chat.
Harry sent the message yesterday.
Great, perfect.
Yeah, I'll try to send it out again with these links.
How do you copy something in the chat? How do you copy that?
Just, Jim, just click it.
Yeah.
It'll open up in your browser and then you can.
Oh, okay, great.
Isn't there some way to save your chat too? I thought I saw that once, but
There is
now
definitely some way of doing it that is far, far, far above my.
Harry sent the message.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks again, Sidra. This
All
was
right.
beautiful.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
Yes. How do you copy that?
Just, Jim, just click it.
Yeah.
It'll open up in your browser and then you can.
I did it. Yes. Thank you for explaining. There was that extra step that I didn't know about. Okay.
Okay, have a great day, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks so much again. So.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Sidra. This was